If you're familiar with Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns, you might be wondering how I could possibly think that one of the best series ever made comic books worse. But it did, for about a decade, and I'm going to explain how. The Dark Knight Returns came out in 1986, and it's been a favorite among comic book fans ever since. Miller's not-so-kid-friendly story of a grizzled Batman coming out of retirement to dole out some street-level justice
Go ahead. Make my day.
connected with a huge audience. I'm not throwing shade on The Dark Knight Returns, and this isn't a criticism of Miller's work, but there's an unspoken downside to it all. My goal here is to examine that downside, not pick a fight with Miller. The problem isn't with him, it's with the industry that learned all of the wrong lessons from his work and gave us a dreadful decade of comics. Before we can examine the impact of Miller's work, we need to know how things looked before it came out. The first thing to understand is where Batman stood in the pop culture landscape, and the reality was, he was practically invisible. Other than the Super Friends cartoon, which was aimed at kids, there was nothing. There were no movies, no video games, none of that stuff. In the mid-80s, Batman didn't have a presence outside of comics, and his main title was selling at a historically low 75,000 copies a month. At the time, if anyone bothered to think about Batman, the image that came to mind was Adam West.
We've got to keep in mind that the main image people have of superheroes is Adam West playing Batman on the old TV show.
Even though the 60s show had been off the air for nearly 20 years, it was still in syndication. So for most people, Adam West was Batman. This meant that no one was ready for the bomb that Frank Miller was about to drop on pop culture when Book 1 of The Dark Knight Returns hit the shelves. Miller's grim and gritty take on Batman was shocking. Just imagine if you thought Batman was this, and suddenly it was this. The comic was an instant hit. The demand was so great that DC had to make several reprints, and eventually a collected edition of the 4 issues that became one of the best-selling graphic novels of all time. The trade paperback allowed it to reach a much wider audience because it could be sold in bookstores and other places that typically didn't sell comics. The good news was that a lot of these readers stuck around. In the months that followed the release of The Dark Knight Returns, sales of the regular monthly Batman title shot up to just under 200,000 copies per month. What's critical here is that the main Batman title was completely different from The Dark Knight Returns. It wasn't grim and gritty like Miller's work, but these new, mostly adult readers hopped on board anyway. The lesson should have been that comics didn't have to be dark or violent to appeal to mature readers.
The adventures of the Caped Crusader are fueling a $400 million industry that's growing by 25% each year. And who's buying all those comic books? The industry says that 70% are purchased by people over 21.
All of this momentum around Batman had other implications as well. In the early 80s, Warner Brothers had been in talks with Ivan Reitman to make a Batman movie, but a series of complications, including the recent disappointment of Superman 3, shut down plans for any development. The breakthrough success of The Dark Knight Returns changed everything. Within a few months of issue 4 being released, Warner Brothers hired Tim Burton, and a Batman film went into production. Luckily for all of us, this change in director freed up Reitman to give us Kindergarten Cop.
It might be a tumor.
It's not a tumor.
In less than a year, Batman had gone from being an afterthought to a phenomenon. And this is where the problems begin. Publishers and creators each had their own reasons to try to replicate the success of The Dark Knight Returns. For publishers, it was obvious. They were after massive sales that could turn a comic book into a multi-billion-dollar movie franchise. And for creators, it was a chance to advance their career. Frank Miller's work caught the attention of Hollywood, and he wrote the scripts for 2 RoboCop sequels. Eventually, his own comics, Sin City and 300, would also become major motion pictures. Now, in these next 2 parts, I'm going to be talking about how Marvel and DC each tried to recreate the success of The Dark Knight Returns. When I do that, I'm going to be talking about broad trends that each of the companies followed, and that definitely doesn't include everything that they put out during this time. But it's going to show how a desire to live up to The Dark Knight Returns clouded judgments and led to a lot of bad decisions that shaped a decade's worth of comics. When it came to Marvel, they took the grim and gritty context of The Dark Knight Returns and harnessed it into a near company-wide edginess. In 1988, Marvel launched a new title called The Punisher War Journal, and the similarities to The Dark Knight Returns were pretty obvious. For starters, Both comics featured violent anti-heroes who were motivated by personal trauma, so the same kinds of stories can be told with each character. That could be an alienating read, but writer Carl Potts adopted Miller's technique of using an internal monologue that led us into the mind of the Punisher. Because we knew what he was thinking, it was easier for us to relate to what he was doing. His thoughts justified his actions, and like The Dark Knight Returns, it read like a psychological profile. This was Marvel's first attempt to copy The Dark Knight Returns, and it kind of worked. The series was a hit, and Marvel even invested in sending the creative team on a publicity tour, but it didn't break through to the mainstream the way Frank Miller's work did. But that kind of success was just around the corner for them. Todd McFarlane had recently taken over the art duties on The Amazing Spider-Man, and some low-key buzz was starting to build around the series. His style was unique, and his eye-catching covers were hard to ignore.
There you go. Thank you.
Right now, the smart money is riding on Todd McFarlane. He's a 27-year-old artist who lives on Vancouver Island. He makes his living drawing Spider-Man comic books. He's a superstar celebrity among the comic book set, and his mega fame surprises even him.
Just 3 issues into McFarlane's run, Amazing Spider-Man 300 came out. It was the first full appearance of Venom, but that wasn't seen as a big deal at the time. What really got noticed was that McFarlane inked his own pencils. That changed the tone of the book, and the future of Marvel. Check out issue 299 on the left, which was inked by Bob McLeod, and issue 300 on the right, inked by McFarlane. That heavy ink, the use of black to fill empty spaces, all of the shadows, the cross-hatching, that's all inspired by The Dark Knight Returns. McFarlane's art pushed the Spider-Man series into a darker, more edgy direction. His style tended to give everything a more sinister look. Take the Lizard, for example. The character hadn't changed all that much since his debut back in 1963, but look what McFarlane did with him. Sales continued to grow, and more than a full year after Venom first appeared in issue 300, he made his return in issue 315. This is where everything came together, and Marvel found its new template. Combine an extreme art style with a dark and brooding character to make comics a visual experience only. The story was secondary. With the success of his run on The Amazing Spider-Man, McFarlane was given his own title with the character, one which he'd not only draw, but also write, because writing didn't matter anymore. It was promoted as a mature take on Spider-Man, but it wasn't challenging or sophisticated, it was just more violent. That's what mature meant now. With Marvel's new approach of selling stylized art over stories, Rob Liefeld rebooted the New Mutants as X-Force. It was a carbon copy of the McFarlane template, forgettable stories with splashy artwork. Marvel did this over and over again. They were officially in the extreme art, grim and gritty business. The ultimate irony is that in the middle of all of this, artist Jim Lee and celebrated writer Chris Claremont launched a new X-Men title. Unlike most of the other comics that Marvel was putting out, this new X-Men book wasn't dark or brooding. It had a similar but scaled-back dynamic art style that was part of the new Marvel template, but thematically, it was optimistic. In true X-Men tradition, the series dealt with weighty issues like prejudice and identity, but even when things got tough for the group, there was still an underlying message of hope, and the idea that a better tomorrow was always possible. The first issue sold over 8 million copies, setting a record that is yet to be broken. This is the book that broke all sales records, but did Marvel pull back from their dark turn and start investing in better stories? Nope. It was all grimdark for the foreseeable future. This is gonna be rough. While Marvel were satisfied selling splash page filled comics full of angry anti-heroes, DC went off the deep end. Aquaman had his hand replaced with a harpoon. Guy Gardner became this, and they turned Wonder Woman into a biker lady. These were all lame attempts to keep up with Marvel's new tone, but nothing shocking. Not yet, anyway. Bane broke Batman's back, and he was replaced by a complete psychopath named Azrael. Not long after, Hal Jordan went on a killing spree and wiped out most of the Green Lantern Corps. But none of these stories make the cut, because I'm going to focus on the really bad stuff. DC's first major misstep came in 1988, just 2 years after The Dark Knight Returns was released. In one of the most cynical marketing moves in history, DC had their fans call a 1-900 number to decide whether or not the Joker would murder Robin. I say murder, but I'm underselling it here. The Joker used a crowbar to beat Robin to a pulp as his mother looked on, then left the two of them to die in an explosion. The supposed purpose of calling the hotline was to determine if they'd be saved before the bomb went off. But given the climate of the time, there was no doubt the way that story was going to go. They called the series A Death in the Family, Everyone knew what was going to happen. A few years later, DC were at it again.
As the Man of Steel met his match, an editor at DC Comics says Superman will die November 18th.
That's right. At the height of this joyless era of ultraviolence, DC decided to kill Superman, a character who'd been a symbol of hope for well over 50 years. Hope was literally dead. This was a massive event fueled by greed and bloodlust, and it sold millions of comics. And they weren't just content to kill him. When it came time to toy with the idea of bringing him back, one of the versions of Superman that replaced him was a homicidal cyborg. I swear I'm not making this up. In better hands, that could have been a brilliant meta comment on the state of the industry, but it wasn't. That was just the state of the industry, and a true low point. And finally, in one of the most truly demoralizing moments in comic book history, something so senselessly violent took place that is now known as a trope. Women in refrigerators. Oh boy. After Hal Jordan went crazy and killed off all the Green Lanterns, Kyle Rayner became the Earth's new guardian. Along with Rayner, writer Ron Mars created Alex DeWitt as his love interest. For several months, Mars invested in DeWitt as a character. She looked like she was going to be a mainstay. But one day Kyle came home and found Alex's strangled corpse stuffed into his refrigerator. Now, this wasn't the most violent or extreme thing to ever happen in the pages of a comic book. It's nothing compared to what was seen in the pre-code horror comics of the 1950s, but it struck a nerve. When this issue came out, the biggest news story in America was the murder of Nicole Brown Simpson, so the public was primed to be sensitive when it came to issues involving violence against women. This was the wrong story at the wrong time. Years later, Mars shared his thoughts on the matter. Here's what he had to say.
I created her with the intention of having her be murdered at the hands of Major Force. I took a lot of care in building her as a character because I wanted her to be liked and her death to mean something to the readers. I wanted readers to be horrified at the crime and to empathize with Kyle's loss. Thus the fridge.
It boggles the mind to think of how a serious real-world issue could be dealt with in such a ham-fisted way. But I have to take back what I said about Cyborg Superman going on a killing spree being the low point of this era. I don't think we can get any more dispassionately lower than thus the fridge. While I think this era will always be associated with extreme art and the rise of grim and gritty characters, there were other comics out there, and a lot of them were really good. One of the ones that I loved was Keith Giffen and J.M. DeMatteis' Justice League International. There wasn't anything new or groundbreaking in the series, but it was a really fun read. If you were tired of characters overloaded with guns and pouches, this is probably where you got your superhero fix. At the same time, if you were just fed up with what Marvel, DC, and now Image were doing, and decided to look elsewhere, there's a good chance you found Bone.
The Bone books are about three lost cousins who find themselves in a mysterious valley where they meet monsters and dragons and princesses, and they uncover a few secrets along the way.
Bone was a comic that could be read by anyone of any age, and it became one of the go-to books for people who were just turned off by what was happening in most superhero comics. Having alternatives was nice, but pushing back was even better. The first issue of Animal Man came out around the same time that people were voting to have Robin murdered. When we first see Animal Man in the series, his alter ego Buddy Baker is saving a cat from a tree. Try finding that in an issue of The Punisher.
When I did Animal Man way back, that was only 2 years after Dark Knight, and already I was sick of that stuff. It's just time to get back to the kind of superheroes we like. A guy who would look out for people, who would take the time to rescue a kitten or a lost lizard. We just wanted to do a nice guy again.
If all Morrison did was give us a series of these more innocent Silver Age style stories, I'd have been happy, but they went well beyond that. In an issue of the series that breaks the barrier between the creator and the created, Animal Man the character confronts Grant Morrison the writer. Realizing that Morrison has full control over his life story, Buddy wants to know why his wife and kids were murdered. Morrison's reply was a devastating comment on the industry.
We'll stop at nothing, you see. All of the suffering and the death and the pain in your world is entertainment for us. Why does blood and torture and anguish still excite us? We thought that by making your world more violent, we could make it more realistic, more adult. God help us if that's what it means. Maybe, for once, we can try to be kind.
And with a stroke of their pen, Morrison undoes it all. Buddy's wife and kids are alive again, as if their murders never happened. Things like realism and continuity just didn't matter in the face of giving kindness a chance. In 1992, Mark Waid took over the writing duties on The Flash and made an immediate impact. He focused on character development and personal relationships while still maintaining a high level of adventure. At a time when a lot of comic books were lacking substance, Waid explored mythic storytelling, diving into the character's past and creating a legacy for modern readers. At the heart of every issue was a good story, and the series was unapologetically fun. It combined the spirit of a Silver Age comic with contemporary sensibilities, which stood out in a way that challenged other creators to do better. A couple of years later, artist Alex Ross and writer Kurt Busiek released Marvels for Marvel, and it made a big impact. The series explored key moments in the history of the Marvel Universe as seen through the eyes of a common person. Ross's painted panels created a sense of realism that defied the more extreme art styles of the time, and the story itself invoked a strong sense of nostalgia. It reminded modern readers of how comics used to be before darker times set in. But Ross wasn't done yet. In 1996, exactly 10 years after The Dark Knight Returns was released, Ross and writer Mark Waid put out the first issue of Kingdom Come for DC. Kingdom Come was a powerful meta-comment on the dark path that many superhero comics had gone down, and it serves as the perfect bookend to The Dark Knight Returns. Where Frank Miller's work tells the story of a hero coming out of retirement and embracing a new level of violence, Kingdom Come tells the story of a group of heroes coming out of retirement to end the reign of a generation of violent anti-heroes. The comic was a scathing rebuke of almost everything that we'd seen unfold over the last 10 years. Ross and Waid's work created a demand for comics with a brighter tone. They made grim and gritty seem passé, and after a while, even cringy. It didn't happen overnight, but this call-out was a force of change, and the decade of darkness started to fade away. And there it is. That's my hot take on The Dark Knight Returns and how one of the best comics of all time ruined the industry for a decade. If you have something to say, and I have a feeling you might, please sound off in the comments. If you like what you saw, give it a like. And if you think you might want to hear more from me, please consider subscribing. Most of all, thanks for watching. Bye for now.